During the COVID-19 lockdown, I've been getting to know George Herbert. And during August, I've been introducing him to the village church. George Herbert was born in 1593 and died in 1633. And George Herbert is one of the greatest religious poets of all time. And over the centuries, Christians, including Charles Spurgeon, Richard Baxter and C.S. Lewis, have engaged with and enjoyed his profound poetry. I'm not a poetry expert, far from it. I'm not really even a poetry enthusiast. But that's one of the things that makes George Herbert so special, that even someone like me can engage with and enjoy his profound poetry. And on Sunday evenings in August, we're reading and reflecting on a George Herbert poem together. And the poem for this evening follows on from last Sunday evening, and it's called The Sacrifice. And the theme of this poem is the suffering of Christ. No one has ever suffered like Jesus. And the sacrifice narrates his suffering. All of George Herbert's poems contain biblical ideas and biblical images. But this poem, The Sacrifice, is saturated with the scriptures. It's basically a paraphrase of the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, with George Herbert presenting the events in chronological order. But what makes this poem so powerful is that Jesus Christ himself is the narrator. The sacrifice is about the suffering of Christ, but not just his physical suffering. It begins in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it ends on the cross. And along the way, George Herbert explores much more than the physical suffering of Christ. He wants us to see, and he wants us to feel that although the physical suffering was great, the non-physical suffering was far, far greater. And this emphasis in the poem reflects the emphasis in the Bible. The Bible only gives a few lines to the physical suffering of Christ. Most of the New Testament is about the non-physical suffering of Christ. And so let's read the poem. This is The Sacrifice by George Herbert. O all ye who pass by, whose eyes and mind to worldly things are sharp, but to me blind. To me, who took eyes that I might you find, was ever grief like mine. The princes of my people make a head against their maker, they do wish me dead, who cannot wish except I give them bread, was ever grief like mine. Without me each one who doth now me brave had to this day been an Egyptian slave. They used that power against me which I gave, was ever grief like mine. Mine own apostle, who the bag did bear, though he had all I had, did not forbear to sell me also and to put me there, was ever grief like mine. For 30 pence he did my death devise, who at 300 did the ointment prize, not half so sweet as my sweet sacrifice, was ever grief like mine. Therefore my soul melts, and my heart's dear treasure drops blood, the only beads, my words to measure. O let this cup pass, if it be thy pleasure, was ever grief like mine. These drops being tempered with a sinner's tears, a balm for both the hemispheres, curing all wounds but mine, all but my fears, was ever grief like mine. Yet my disciples sleep, I cannot gain 1 hour of watching, but their drowsy brain comforts not me, and doth my doctrine stain, was ever grief like mine. Arise, arise, they come, look how they run. Alas, what haste they make to be undone, how their lanterns do they seek the sun, was ever grief like mine. With clubs and staves they seek me, as a thief, who am the way, the truth, the true relief, most true to those who are my greatest grief, was ever grief like mine. Judas, dost thou betray me with a kiss? Canst thou find hell about my lips, and miss of life just at the gates of life and bliss? Was ever grief like mine? See, they lay hold on me, not with the hands of faith, but fury, yet at their commands I suffer binding who have loosed their bands. Was ever grief like mine? All my disciples fly. Fear puts a bar betwixt my friends and me. They leave the star that brought the wise men of the east from far. Was ever grief like mine? Then from one ruler to another bound, they lead me, urging that it was not sound what I taught. Comments would the text confound. Was ever grief like mine? The priest and rulers all false witness seek gainst him who seeks not life but is meek, and ready Paschal lamb of this great week. Was ever grief like mine? Then they accuse me of great blasphemy, that I did thrust into the deity, who never thought that any robbery. Was ever grief like mine? Some said that I the temple to the floor in 3 days raised, and raised as before. Why, he that built the world can do much more. Was ever grief like mine? Then they condemn me all with that same breath, which I do give them daily unto death. Thus Adam my first breathing rendereth. Was ever grief like mine? They bind and lead me unto Herod. He sends me to Pilate. This makes them agree, but yet their friendship is my enmity. Was ever grief like mine? Herod and all his bands do set me light, who teach all hands to war, fingers to fight, and only am the Lord of hosts and might. Was ever grief like mine? Herod in judgment sits while I do stand, examines me with a censorious hand. I him obey who all things else command. Was ever grief like mine? The Jews accuse me with despitefulness, and vying malice with my gentleness, pick quarrels with their only happiness. Was ever grief like mine? I answer nothing, but with patience prove, if stony hearts will melt with gentle love. But who does hawk at eagles with a dove? Was ever grief like mine? My silence rather doth augment their cry. My dove doth back into my bosom fly, because the raging waters still are high. Was ever grief like mine? Hark how they cry aloud still, crucify! It is not fit he live a day, they cry, who cannot live less than eternally. Was ever grief like mine? Pilate a stranger holdeth off, but they, mine own dear people, cry, away, away, with noises confused, frighting the day. Was ever grief like mine? Yet still they shout and cry and stop their ears, putting my life among their sins and fears, and therefore wish my blood on them and theirs. Was ever grief like mine? See how spite cankers things. These words are right, used and wished are the whole world's light, but honey is their gall, brightness their night. Was ever grief like mine? They choose a murderer, and all agree in him to do themselves a courtesy, for it was their own cause who killed me. Was ever grief like mine? And a seditious murderer he was, but I the Prince of Peace, peace that doth pass all understanding, more than heaven doth glass. Was ever grief like mine? Why, Caesar is their only king, not I. He clave the stony rock when they were dry, but surely not their hearts, as I well try. Was ever grief like mine? Ah, how they scourge me, yet my tenderness doubles each lash, and yet their bitterness winds up my grief to a mysteriousness. Was ever grief like mine? They buffet me, and box me as they list, who grasped the earth and heaven with my fist, and never yet whom I would punish missed, was ever grief like mine. Behold, they spit on me in scornful wise, who by my spittle gave the blind man eyes, leaving his blindness to mine enemies, was ever grief like mine. My face they cover, though it be divine, as Moses' face was veiled, so is mine, lest on their double dark souls either shine, was ever grief like mine. Servants and abjects flout me, they are witty. Now prophesy who strikes thee, is their ditty. So they in me deny themselves all pity, was ever grief like mine. And now I am delivered unto death, which each one calls for so with utmost breath, that he before me well nigh suffereth, was ever grief like mine. Weep not, dear friends, since I for both have wept, when all my tears were blood the while you slept. Your tears for your own fortunes should be kept, was ever grief like mine. The soldiers lead me to the common hall, there they deride me, they abuse me all, yet for 12 heavenly legions I could call, was ever grief like mine. Then with a scarlet robe they me array, which shows my blood to be the only way, and cordial left to repair man's decay, was ever grief like mine. Then on my head a crown of thorns I wear, for these are all the grapes Zion doth bear, though I my vine planted and watered there, was ever grief like mine. So sits the earth's great curse in Adam's fall upon my head, so I remove it all, from the earth unto my brows, and bear the thrall, was ever grief like mine. Then with the reed they gave to me before, they strike my head, the rock from whence all store of heavenly blessings issue evermore, was ever grief like mine. They bow their knees to me and cry, Hail, King! Whatever scoffs or scornfulness can bring, I am the floor, the sink, where they it fling, was ever grief like mine. Yet since man's sceptres are as frail as reeds, and thorny all their crowns, bloody their weeds, I, who am truth, turn into truth their deeds, was ever grief like mine. The soldiers also spit upon that face, which angels did desire to have the grace, and prophets once to see, but found no place, was ever grief like mine. Thus trimmed forth they bring me to the rout, who crucify him, cry with one strong shout, God holds his peace at man, and man cries out, was ever grief like mine. They lead me in once more, and putting then mine own clothes on, they lead me out again, whom devils fly, thus is he tossed of men, was ever grief like mine. And now weary of sport, glad to engross, all spite in one, counting my life their loss, they carry me to my most bitter cross, was ever grief like mine. My cross I bear myself until I faint, then Simon bears it for me by constraint, the decreed burden of each mortal saint, was ever grief like mine. O all ye who pass by, behold and see, man stole the fruit, but I must climb the tree of life to all, but only me, was ever grief like mine. Lo, here I hang, charged with a world of sin, the greater world of the two, for that came in by words, but this by sorrow I must win, was ever grief like mine. Such sorrow, as if sinful man could feel, or feel his part, he would not cease to kneel, till all were melted, though he were all steel, was ever grief like mine. But, O my God, why leavest thou me? the Son in whom thou dost delight to be, my God, my God. Never was grief like mine. Shame tears my soul, my body many a wound. Sharp nails pierce this, but sharper that confound reproaches which are free, while I am bound. Was ever grief like mine? Now heal thyself, physician, now come down. Alas, I did so when I left my crown, and father's smile for you to feel his frown. Was ever grief like mine? In healing not myself there doth consist all that salvation which ye now resist. Your safety in my sickness doth subsist. Was ever grief like mine? Betwixt two thieves I spend my utmost breath, as he that for some robbery suffereth. Alas, what have I stolen from you? Death. Was ever grief like mine? A king my title is, prefixed on high, yet by my subjects am condemned to die. A servile death in servile company. Was ever grief like mine? They gave me vinegar mingled with gall, but more with malice. Yet when they did call with manna, angels' food, I fed them all. Was ever grief like mine? They part my garments, and by lot dispose my coat, the type of love which once cured those who sought for help, never malicious foes. Was ever grief like mine? Nay, after death their spite shall further go, for they will pierce my side. I full well know that as sin came, so sacraments might flow. Was ever grief like mine? But now I die, now all is finished, my woe, man's weal, and now I bow my head. Only let others say, when I am dead, never was grief like mine. The Sacrifice is a long poem, and so I'll keep these reflections short. But there are themes running through the Sacrifice. There's the idea that Jesus has given people gifts, but that these very people have rejected the giver. So, for example, in lines 5 to 7, Jesus says, I gave the Jews bread. Think of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. But then Jesus says, the Jews wish me dead. They receive the gifts, but they reject the giver. Or there's the idea that Jesus is God. Jesus is the God of the Exodus, the sustainer of life, the deity equal to God himself. Jesus is the creator of the world. He built it all. And Jesus is the one who lives eternally. There are these themes running through the Sacrifice. But you can also pause and ponder a particular paragraph. One of my favourites is lines 201 to 204. O all ye who pass by, behold and see. Man stole the fruit, but I must climb the tree of life to all, but only me. Was ever grief like mine? Or in other words, the cross was a tree of death for Jesus, but the cross is a tree of life for us. We've rebelled, we deserve to die, but Jesus climbed that tree for us. He was cursed so that we could be blessed. What a sacrifice, what a saviour. Or in lines 213 to 216, there's something missing. And I think that's very deliberate. George Herbert has left a few words out here for us to fill in. But oh my God, why leavest thou me, the Son in whom thou dost delight to be? My God, why have you forsaken me? That's what George Herbert wants us to fill in here. And by getting us to fill that in, he's getting us to reflect on the horror of the cross. Jesus was forsaken. Jesus was forsaken by God. He was forsaken by God for us so that we might be forgiven by God. And in these lines, George Herbert wants us to reflect on the horror of the cross again. And he helps us to do that by changing the last line. This time it doesn't say, was ever grief like mine. This time it says, never was grief like mine. No one has ever suffered like Jesus. And the sacrifice finishes with Jesus saying, only let others say when I am dead, never was grief like mine. And so let us say this evening, never was grief like his. His suffering was unimaginable, but he suffered unimaginably for us.